So we've been mentioning this conflict between the id, the ego, and superego. This conflict can become intense, and it's happening right in your mind. It's not these are things that we are thinking about, that we're dealing with. And this conflict can be ugly, and this conflict can result in anxiety. You might be anxiety in that you're afraid that your id is going to get out of control and your ego is not going to be strong enough to hold back. You might think that the superego is laying it down how guilty you feel, and now you're feeling really down on yourself because of your superego. So you got to be able to balance it out, and so this dynamic conflict between these three components will result in anxiety. But we have ways of defending ourselves against that anxiety. We have these called defense mechanisms that allow us to deal with these urges in an effective, sometimes ineffective way, but in a way that protects us from anxiety. Sometimes these defense mechanisms actually, in fact most of the time, they actually are distorting reality. We are not thinking of our urges the way they really are, and perhaps we're not perceiving the world in the same way. So this urges may be in some way diverted, they may be distorted, and we'll talk about some various common defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms could be unhealthy, but not necessarily. Some are considered healthier than others. For example, sublimation is considered a healthy defense mechanism, while denial is not a very healthy one. But the defense mechanisms all start with the one key defense mechanism, and that is repression. And this is where you push unacceptable impulses out of your awareness. This is where you're using your unconscious in an effective way. You are pushing all of these unpleasant thoughts, feelings, and whatnot into your unconscious. If it's in your unconscious, it's out of your awareness. You don't have to worry about it anymore. Maybe it'll come out in your dreams or something like that. But basically, you're taking all of these unpleasant thoughts and whatnot, you're putting them into your unconscious. If it's out of your awareness, then you're going to have less anxiety. So as I said before, repression is the foundation for all of them. It's something that we are all doing, according to Freud, that we are all putting these unpleasant thoughts into our unconscious. We don't have to be anxious about it. A good analogy for the structure of our mind, according to Freud, is the iceberg analogy. When you look at an iceberg, when you're out on the ocean and you're on a boat and you look at an iceberg, what you see on the iceberg is the very, very tip that stands out above the water. The large majority of the iceberg is under the surface. Well, the same idea goes into play in Freud's theory. Your conscious mind, what you're thinking about right now at this moment, what you can say about yourself right now at this moment, that is just the tip of the iceberg. So your personality as you see it, as you can describe it for me right now consciously, according to Freud, is really just the tip of the iceberg. Underneath, in the deep, dark blue water, is your unconscious. And within the unconscious, you have the id, which exists entirely in the unconscious. The id is these unconscious wishes, these unconscious desires that are pushing us. Our sex drive is coming from the id, and it's pushing us to do things, good and bad. The ego's job, as I said before, is to satisfy the needs of the id, but it has to deal with reality. So you notice here that some of the ego is directly ego directly in contact with the real world, with your conscious mind. And thus the ego can make the navigation between your id and the real world, can help satisfy those needs. Finally, you have the superego. And the superego also has connections with the ego and the id, but is also in the conscious world, in that we are consciously aware of what we've learned about right and wrong, so we are consciously aware of that. But then, nevertheless, your superego, your id, and your ego are going to be in constant flux. There's always going to be some kind of disagreement among the three personality aspects. But again, this is according to Freud's theory. Okay, so let's talk about those defense mechanisms, most common defense mechanisms. Start with repression, forgetting the unacceptable. So perhaps some really unpleasant memory you have that you don't even want to remember. You can push it out of your consciousness. And maybe, again, any kind of those wishes, perhaps. Maybe you have these sexual feelings that are making you feel guilty. Well, you push those out of your consciousness into your unconscious. Maybe you're having violent thoughts, and it is making you feel anxiety to have these horrible thoughts of violence. Well, you got to be able to essentially take those thoughts out of your conscious mind, put them in your unconscious, and you can kind of breathe a little bit easier. And that's what repression does. Recognize, however, recent research essentially says that you really can't do this indefinitely. You have a reservoir, essentially, of how much you can store from these thoughts, feelings, and whatnot, and that it takes a lot of energy to keep all of this stuff down. Sort of like a pot of boiling water with the cover on it. Eventually, the cover is going to pop right off. Rationalization is another very common defense mechanism. With rationalization, you are looking perhaps at some aspect of yourself, maybe something you did that was not very ethical, let's say. Okay? But now you can claim that you did it for a different reason. Maybe have a better, make it look like you're a better person, when in reality it's not the real reason. Let's say, for example, you fail your next psychology exam, and you could now maybe the real reason why you failed the exam is because you just didn't want to study. You would rather watch your TV shows and you didn't want to study. Maybe that's the real reason. But you know if that is the real reason, that you becoming aware of that would make you feel like you are a bad person. So you would feel guilty about making those choices, choosing to watch TV rather than study, and thus you failed your test. Well, you might decide to rationalize instead of feeling guilty about yourself. You might say, well, maybe the teacher really was unfair and the test was unfair and that's why I failed. Or you have a really good reason for why, for you're watching the TV. Maybe there was something really important you needed to see, and that it was not going to be on any other night. You had to watch it then, and that was why you did it. But really, maybe the real reason was that you're scared, and the material that you're reading, it scares you that you don't quite understand it, so you don't even want to try to read it. So you watch TV, sabotage yourself, and then you just say, well, it's just unfair teacher, or I had no other choice, I had to do it. So these are ways we can kind of fool ourselves. Displacement is another very common defense mechanism, something you might recognize yourself. You have feelings towards one object and you shift it towards another. Let's give a practical example. Let's say you're at work and your boss yells at you and humiliates you in front of your coworkers and in front of other people who do not work there, customers or whatnot. So you have been humiliated in front of all these people. And you just keep your mouth shut and look down. You don't talk back. Okay? But inside you're feeling anguish and anger. You really unconsciously want to just throttle that boss. Throw that boss out the window. But you really can't do that practically. You'll at least get fired, but possibly also get arrested. So you don't want to do that. But this energy, this seething fury that's coming from your id, by the way, that's pushing you to just attack and kill, well, it needs to be expressed in a safer way. So you might go home to your loving husband and you notice that your loving husband left socks on the floor again. And after being humiliated by your boss and keeping your mouth shut and your seething anger, and you come home and you see those socks on the floor, my goodness, you unload on your poor husband and you yell at him and you curse him and you are just yelling, and your husband is saying, "What did I do?" Well, this is a classic example of displacement. These feelings of anger and hostility that you were feeling toward your boss, justifiable, but you couldn't express it in that circumstance. You're able to express it in a safe environment with your poor, loving, and understanding husband, who kind of has to take it. And again, this is an example of displacement. You're expressing that anger and hostility to a safer target. In fact, during psychoanalysis, which is the procedure that Freud developed for treating people with these hysteria symptoms, he would basically set up a circumstance where in the therapy environment, he would want the client to actually self-disclose and displace onto him. So in other words, the therapist might say, "Talk to me like you're talking to your mother." If there's some hostility between the patient and the patient's mother, who may be dead 20 years for all we know. But now these unconscious urges can be shifted, displaced onto the therapist in a safe environment. Sublimation. This is where you take an urge that might be not a very politically correct urge. Again, like throttling and killing your boss and throwing the dead body out the window would be an example of a pretty nasty impulse. But now, so if you went ahead and did that, it would be immoral. It would also be impractical because it would get you into a lot of trouble. So you got to do something with this anger. So maybe you take this anger, which is really just a ball of energy, and you maybe change the direction of that energy. Not just yelling at some other schlub, that would be displacement, but to perhaps change the nature of this energy into something that is not about aggression and hostility, but maybe more artistic, or maybe going into sports or something like that, or exercising or running. These are things that you can do that are sublimation, taking this hostility and just changing the energy into something productive. Projection is another common defense mechanism. And this is where you perhaps see something unpleasant in yourself, an aspect of yourself that you're not proud of. And if you were to ruminate on this and think about how you have this characteristic, it would certainly make you feel depressed and it would make you feel terrible. So one of the things that somebody could do is to engage in projection, in which they have these unpleasant feelings about themselves and they just basically attribute that to other people, and you have some other person accuse that other person. An example of this might be a loving husband who unfortunately has some thoughts about spreading his loving to other people outside the relationship. He knows it's morally wrong, but he has these urges anyway, and in fact he still does it on occasion. He has one-night stands. He doesn't like that aspect about himself. He's not proud of it. So he has to find a way to perhaps express it in a way that will make him feel less anxiety. So imagine this man who has these urges and who has acted on those urges is walking along the beach with his wife, and his wife just takes a glance at a very attractive man also who is walking along the beach. Maybe she looks at him just a tad too long. Well, now the husband gets really angry at her and yells at her and accuses her of wanting to cheat and wanting to have sex with that guy, when in reality it's he who's had those urges and he who's acted on them. So now he has found an opportunity to accuse his wife of having those urges. And again, you can see that this can go into a hostile spiral there with the relationship. Reaction formation is another form of defense mechanism. And this is where you have these urges, these emotions, perhaps about a particular issue, a particular person, and you instead will do the opposite. So you will behave in the opposite way the urge is telling you. Maybe the urge that you have, you are not proud of, and perhaps you want to do the exact opposite of it. So, for example, you might have someone who has very strong sexual feelings, and strong sexual feelings toward a member of the same sex. But according to his religion and his upbringing, he believes that homosexual behavior is sinful, and that these urges are evil and sinful. So he now has to deal with it, and one of the ways he deals with it is perhaps by doing the exact opposite, and perhaps doing it in a very vocal way. So maybe someone who has these same-sex urges might engage in reaction formation by becoming a very outspoken critic of same-sex marriage, and just would really be particularly homophobic and particularly hostile and angry towards people who are gay. And again, this comes from reaction formation because he had those urges himself, and is now expressing tenfold the opposite. Denial is a very problematic defense mechanism. This is where you have a real life situation and you are essentially denying it. You are saying, nope, this doesn't exist and I don't believe it, and you're kind of hiding in your shell. Denial can't last forever because reality will end up hitting you. If you are an alcoholic and you deny the fact that you have a drinking problem, that's an example of denial. But you can't continue. This denial will not last forever. You're going to keep on drinking. You're going to keep on ruining your life. And you can't just keep going and denying. Eventually you will going to have to admit it. So denial helps make you feel better for the moment. Okay? Nobody would like to say, I'm an alcoholic. Isn't that wonderful? But they do want to, they don't want to, but by denying it, you can feel better for the moment. Finally, regression is a defensive mechanism in which you revert to earlier, safer behavior from your childhood. So, for example, when an adult doesn't get what he or she wants, he or she might have a temper tantrum, like a little baby. And that's an example of regression. Makes you feel better to kind of go back to the thumb sucking, or going back to mama, going back to things that worked when you were a child, when you're dealing with the frustrations as an adult.